Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I don't have a lot to say this morning since I think pretty much everybody knows the drill now. So I'm just going to hand it over to Rick Warner from Wabash College, and we'll go from there. So,
hey, thanks for having me. My colleague Stephen Merle was here yesterday. We're tag teaming because we have a huge visit day this weekend, and so neither of us could be here both days. So I'm really pleased to be here. Our first paper is by Ken Hall. He's a professor of history at Ball State University here. Specializes in the history of pre-1500 Southeast Asia, South India, and the Indian Ocean network societies. His most recent books are An Early History of Southeast Asia, Maritime Trade and Societal Development, printed in 2011. Networks of Trade and Societal Integration in the Chola era of South India, circa 875 to 1279. That came out this year. And the edited volumes, The Growth of Non-Western Cities, Primary and Secondary Urban Networking, and New Perspectives on the History and Historiography of Southeast Asia. It's been very busy. He held a Fulbright Senior Scholar appointment doing archaeological research in Cambodia and in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and India in 2012, and serves on the advisory board of the Journal of Economic and Social History of the Orient. I'm sure there's even more, but I will stop there, and you can hear him speak about his paper, The 18th and Early 19th Century Evolution of Indian Print Culture and Knowledge Networks in Calcutta and Madras.
Thank you. As my introduction says, I'm a real pre-1500 person, so this is a little bit of revisiting things I did in graduate school, which is sort of interesting here as we go into this topic. But it's a really hot field in South Asian studies right now relative to reactive to Orientalist debates and just a lot of other issues that come out of this. So that there is a body of literature, and I'm going to be introducing some of this literature in the process of my presentation today as we go along. But anyway, knowledge networks is what we're looking at, and this came out of our discussion in the last session yesterday as we look at this. In terms of the paper and what it addresses, we have a flow that is here that derives then from this setting, and we see this as developing after the initial European presence in India, Portuguese, Dutch, etc., in terms of the coastal trade networks that are here, and missionaries who follow soon thereafter that we're going to see. The real kind of crisis point of transition is the Battle of Plassey what we're looking at, 1757, as we look at this, 17 whatever, that we're looking at. But again, the British transition of power that is there, where the British East India Company takes over suddenly and finds them in the position of having to administer this and figuring out how to do it. Also under the scrutiny of Parliament, because Parliament plays a role here too of keeping them accountable in the process. So again, the East India Company doesn't do this exclusively on their own, but they have this accountability factor to English society through the Parliament and what they will implement. What they do in the beginning then, as we see, is come back to the churches that are already there specifically, and especially as they have the capacity to print, as they've already established some printing base that is here. Somewhat limited because they don't have the fonts that they need to do the printing effectively. Some of this has been shipped out in the past, but they're beginning to develop these by this point in time. But the British East India Company will bring them into partnership with these presses that are in place, largely to print materials then for government use, forms, otherwise that are here. But then they also begin to address the mission societies as a base, because a lot of the missions have language training skills. And what they especially need then is to decode the law systems of India and something about the culture, as they want to be good, efficient jurists then, as they embrace then administration of India. So we see this in the church publications I talk about in the paper then that are part of this process. From this then we see entry into the civil administration and legal publications that come out of this whole process. But the critical variable, as I'll go on with this then, is the establishment right up front of colleges, and to train the administrators coming in to be good, educated administrators, whether it be in terms of judicial service or local administration or otherwise. And foundational to this service is then training in Indian languages. And here's where we see then the exploration of Indian languages in different ways and different layering of the process that I described in the paper then, as relates to universal issues of language here. And the crisis in this is whether then Indians are a part then of the of the European language traditions, Greco-Roman, etc. here, Greco-Latin, I'm sorry, etc. here, and ultimately embracing then the Aryan tradition, especially Sanskrit then, as a fellow Indo-Aryan language that we have, and how this all is a product then of that entry into the Indian environment we see. The second phase of this that I go into the paper then is actually finding out that all Indian languages are not Indo-Aryan, that Sanskrit is not the base, and there is a previous language tradition that is here in India that they have to sort of adjust accordingly. And my paper goes into this whole process of adjustment then, of going from suddenly Indians being sort of almost like us in the process of this, and finding out that there's something that is even a Indo-Aryan civilization that is there in India that is pretty darn sophisticated in the process of this, and how they deal with that process then of acculturation that we see. The outcome of this, as I note then, are dictionaries, grammars, translations of folklore, Indian text, Dharma Shastra legal traditions that we have here, Quranic law codes, entering eventually into the creation of novels and newspapers then that are the popular press that will derive from this too. So again, this kind of flow process. But critically, in this case, the Bible entries that are here, the missionary societies, a partnership in the initial phase of establishing the colleges, from the colleges becoming then a separate entity, as I'm going to show, of a group of scholars that derive from this, many of them former missionaries who are embraced into this process, and then the production then of print culture that derives from this in time. Here's a listing of the presses, and I don't have this in the paper that I gave to you in the final copy. It will be here, but again, you can kind of get the time frame that we're looking at here. The two critical presses that I'm going to be looking at specifically are the Vepri SPC Mission Society Press, 1761, the Serampore Missions Press, as I'm looking specifically at Calcutta and Madras in the paper, and these become the partnering institutions then with the British as they expand. Here's an idea of what they are producing. This is at Serampore, which is up near modern-day Calcutta. But the New Testament that we have in this instance, again, the focal of the mission societies, then on religious pieces that they're printing. And then translating these into various languages. Bengali the first, because that's where they are in Calcutta in this case, but embracing other language traditions, and where this leads then to all sorts of new interpretation and understanding of language. Again, this is all, as we see from the press, as this is substantially then Christian activities. This is even earlier. This is from Goa, and this is going back to the 16th century, as some of these are available too for us, which is the early printing, where the Portuguese and the Dutch also will have these sort of not very elaborate presses, but they are presses that they use then in establishing materials then for their church services and otherwise as they work out. Then we move here into Serampore. That was just showing this from 1807. In this case, a Marathi translation then of the New Testament that they're putting out at this time. This is the first newspaper in India. This is Hickey's Bengal Gazette. The paper describes this as basically a scandal sheet, which I guess is comparable to many England or London newspapers at the same time. So it establishes itself in common then with the English press tradition that is here too, but it's basically a scandal sheet as we look at this. And he actually barely keeps himself out of jail most of the time that he's publishing this. Interestingly, he is incorporated, though, into the press environment too, and becomes a major factor in developing then the press service then for the English schools that are developed. This is a Tamil translation of the Bible. This goes back to 1723 in this earlier piece. Over on the left-hand side is Telugu. Over on the right is an example of the grammars that they're beginning to produce, which are extremely critical. Again, Tamil on the left. Again, Tamil example here, a dictionary that we have developing here. Interestingly, for those that study Tamil, the Tamil dictionary that we all still use is a product basically of the early 19th century. It's in its republication, but dates back into the 18th century, which is still the best dictionary in the field in the study of Tamil, interestingly here. grammar, here's an example of the textbooks we begin to produce on the left-hand side, and these are largely then for the education then of civil servants coming in and sending them out into the field to do what they need to do. And again, the vocabulary systems that you have that are part of this process. All right, what we have then is a flow pattern of knowledge production that is taking effect here. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have information order, which is the government then providing the basis of an information order, and one of their priority is civil law and management issues here, but how that then transitions then into college scholarship, specifically as it relates to language study that is here. And the important factor here is that the language study is a partnership from the very beginning between British instructors and Indian instructors. And this, as we look at the whole issue of Orientalism that I raised in the paper then, is a sort of starting point, because the initiation of the Orientalism that becomes so critical and criticized by Said later on, in the beginning is, as I note in the paper, maybe it still looks down your nose a little bit at the Indians in this case, but tries to embrace some degree of partnership from the very beginning. And I know in the paper how it could have been otherwise, that they could have really come in and overtaxed them, they could have subjected them, they don't. They really work from the premise then of partnership. And the point of my paper is that this largely continues until the British government takes direct control of India after 1857. That we see here, and where there's a major transformation that is taking place, which is also then coincidental with certain new attitudes in England at the same time that help to influence this transition of power that takes place from the British government will take over. Anyway, we have all these sort of examples. The Guru Simpleton is sort of an interesting embrace of the Tamil folktale, and the popularity of this translation that comes out of the, again, largely this scholarship press that we see here is followed then by an open press that we have then, where you have a lot of native press kind of picking up on this folklore and beginning to develop it and disseminate it then, is the development then of native print culture that we see here, or indigenous print culture that we see developing out of this. And I talk about a little bit about this, which is notion of duplicity and otherwise, which is unfortunately one of the themes of a lot of the early print in this case, and characterize the Indians as conniving, scheming, otherwise in this instance is kind of what you get as some of these folktales that are intended ultimately to critique the elite ultimately here, but where the British will sort of pick up on some of this then in negativities as they look at the Indians that we see. Knowledge networks that we see developing, then we have the missionaries at the top, moving down to the pundits, and I do a lot with the pundits in a part of the paper, because you have this residue of court scholars from the previous princely courts, and the problematic with these, especially as you get into Urdu and Persian traditions that are a legacy then of Mughal rule, and this carries over then into South India in particular relative to Telugu, as it relates then to the fact that there's a grandfathering then of one of the princes in the Telugu region of South India into a position of legacy and partnership with the British. But the problem with this is the pundits then who come from these courts, who are used to being in this court circle, become the instructors of Telugu then in South India. And what they do is embrace a ridiculously overly grammatical Telugu tradition that they control because they also control the press system here. And as a consequence, basically, there's an alienation of language that develops out of this as I develop this in the paper, because this becomes a language of exclusively this intellectual elite. And what you will see is the development of popular Telugu to some extent, but it can't get published because the pundits control the presses. So the alternative in this case is the people that would be Telugu speakers learn English as their first language now that we see, or second in this case. But it really popularizes the use of English as the alternative to this sort of rarefied Telugu that comes out of this. In contrast to Tamil, which is the other South Indian language that does very well as a mainstream language, and its continuity here. But a couple of different examples of what will come out of this in time. This is the important byproduct of this print culture, and that is finding then in India that India is not sort of a dirty little native language, but again it has this legacy as it relates then to this whole study then of language tiering that we see, and where Indo-Aryan, Indo-European languages then become a centerpiece, and this comes out of early 19th century when you begin to embrace this whole process then of seeing this then as a bicultural knowledge network that we see here in time. The problematic, as I note, though, is that the Tamil and other South Indian languages aren't a part of this. They are seen originally as derivative of this because this has to be the way it is, just in the past, when we had this sort of hierarchy of Western languages. But what you're going to see then is the Madras school, which is what I talk about in my paper, developing this alternative, and largely because you're teaching South Indian languages to British civil servants coming in through Madras. And this lays the groundwork for the language studies and the intellectualisms that are there to, again, embrace the fact that there is this other language tradition that we have to kind of deal with here, as opposed to this mainstream of the Western-based. This is an example of the end product of this, and this is from St. Paul's Cathedral, where we have the honorific then of William Jones, who is the architect then of a lot of this initial development in Calcutta that we see. And what is significant about this is the Indian motifs that are here, putting Hinduism in a Christian church. And as we see this statuary that is under the rotunda there, if any of you have been there. But again, we recognize Manu's institutions here, which is from the Dharma Shastra tradition of Hindu law that is here, that's foundational as you embrace this, and it's right there. And even beyond this, we see then all sorts of Indian iconography that is here too on this statue in the end, in which you embrace then Vishnu, as we see in this case. You have all sorts of representations of ambrosia and just all these other sort of things. But at this point in time, Hinduism is okay, because we find the Hindu tradition acknowledgement then of Noah's flood, and also the idea of the tripartite that we see in terms of hierarchies, where you again in India you have the idea of the tripartite divine, here Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Well, in this case you have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva in the tripartite of the Indian tradition. So there's this, again, based upon this Indo-Aryan language tradition, there's an embracing of Hinduism that begins, and then it all falls apart around 1850 as, again, the British take over, and there's a just change of sentiment that derives from this as you look at this. But the point of this is the early partnerships and the embrace of Indian tradition, which just, again, goes a very different direction after the 1850s. This is the inscription that is up here. This building dedicated to Eastern science, again, Eastern science inclusively here, founded for the use of Aryas, Englishmen, and Indians that we see here. The excellent and benevolent men desirous of encouraging knowledge by the favor of God may be learning the literature of India, be ever held in honor, and may the mutual friendship of India and England consistently increase. This is 1883. It's kind of post-1850 here, but it's a legacy going back to Jones, which is honorific in this case. And this is at the Clarendon Library at the University of Oxford, where there's an India institute that is there that was built originally then for the study then of Indian and European relationships. This is an example then of Orientalism in the Indian tradition that we see, where you can see the British in the middle and then surrounded then by various Indian scholars then who are their partners in this enterprise. It's symbolically looking at what I've been looking at here. We have, in the case of Calcutta, the three sectors that are here in this diagram. One is the College of Fort William, which is where the civil servants are being trained. On the bottom side is the press institution that is here. And again, as I note, we see the Shrampur Missionary Press at the foundation before we get into the more popular press. In this case, they also spin off a Hindustani press, which is largely done by the professors then at the college who are doing this to, again, publish Persian Urdu texts that are here that we see. But they spin off their own press in this as opposed to this Rampur press that's been printing in Bengali and Sanskrit here as the legacy that they will have. The kind of other piece of this is the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was created by Warren Hastings and Jones, whom we're looking at here, to create then this institutional, intellectual institution that is there. There's a meeting then of the Indian intellectuals and, again, the British intellectuals, as I showed you in that picture, which represented the members of that. But the idea of this is a mutual scholarship that is taking place here. And this is a part of that legacy of that period where you have these societies, intellectual societies that are very important, very much a part of European intellectual tradition. But you have this, but it becomes a tripartite relationship that develops out of this, of mutuality. But the critical in this case, the Asiatic Society of Bengal is a mutual British and Indian enterprise that we see here, and membership. And validating through this too, and all the other things I've been talking about. College of Fort St. George in Madras follows upon this model as it's established a little bit later. But the College of Fort St. George, they are focal upon the Dravidian languages, and the critical in this case is the Dravidian proof that is here that distinguishes Dravidian language tradition as separate then from the Sanskritic Indo-Aryan tradition that is here in time. And that will come about in 1815. Also in the southern tradition, as opposed to mainstream Hinduism and Islam that you have in the north, you have a lot of elements of Jainism and Buddhism, and as a consequence, where the British in the northern areas have kind of blown this off in their scholarship before in terms of Jainism and Buddhism, we actually find that Jainism and Buddhism have an important role in the evolution of Hinduism that is here. And a lot of that comes out of the South Indian language traditions that are here in the studies thereof. Likewise here, the presses over down at this level, missionary presses in the beginning, and then on the left-hand side, the Madras Oriental Society that is here, which is again the intellectual tradition. But here they do a different thing, and it's largely because you have a viable princely state that is here, where they institute then another intellectual tradition centered in the Nawab's court. And this becomes the center, as I say, then the Pundits, the Sanskrit, the Persian, and sort of the death of Telugu as a language in the process, because they make it overly intellectualized in this case, as opposed to popular-based here. So the end result of that is that most of the Telugu speakers who are upwardly mobile are going to function in English as opposed to their own language here. Here's a distribution then of the Dravidian language traditions, most of them down South India, but dispersed into real sort of hill areas. An example of the embrace that we see, especially in South India, between the Brit and the Prince. This is the point of transition critically, and this is Bishop Wilson who comes in 1832, and he changes the circumstances. The vocabulary is changing along the way here. Let me see. The distinction of caste must be abandoned decidedly, immediately, finally, and those who profess to belong to Christ must give the proof of their having really put off concerning the former conversation, the old, and having really put on the new man in Jesus Christ. The gospel recognized no distinctions such as these castes imposed by a heathen usage, bearing in some respect a supposed religious obligation, condemning those in the lower ranks to perpetual abasement, placing an immobile barrier against all general advancement and improvement in society, cutting asunder the bonds of human fellowship on the one hand and preventing those of Christian love on the other here. Here's our transition that we see in an absolute dividing line that is here, where basically the people previously have sort of seen these in place, but not in a derogatory way, and kind of working within that to bring about mobility. But here an absolute sort of utilitarianist, evangelical type of emphasis that we see taking effect at this time. Sort of a new knowledge order, if you want to, here we see. And here's my final, and this largely I did last night after we had our discussion in our last session yesterday, but we're looking at flows in this case and some of the vocabulary we were using yesterday, which we have the provincial, the cosmopolitan, the metroplexes. Yeah, we have these too as we look at these. I add Bombay to this that I don't talk about in my paper, but again, it's the third center that we see developing out of these emergent secondary cities that we see here. But I'm looking at linguistic locales as I talked about these today and how those are an important factor. But again, the series of publications and print culture aspects that come out of this society that we see in time. So anyway, thank you.
Fascinating stuff. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but let's listen to Lara Putnam. At this point, she's an associate professor of Latin American and Caribbean history at the University of Pittsburgh, specializing in the history of barriers and connections in the modern world. She has explored labor migration and the rise of state racism, popular culture, and black internationalism, as you can see from her paper pretty clearly, and the ways kinship, gender, and sexuality both shape and are shaped by large-scale political and economic shifts. She completed her BA in History and Literature at Harvard College, her PhD in History at the University of Michigan, and she's taught at the University of Universidad de Costa Rica from 2000 to 2003, and she's been at Pitt since 2003. From 2007 to 2012, she was also co-editor of the flagship journal of my field in Latin American Studies, the Hispanic American Historical Review. Her publications include The Company They Kept, Migrants and the Politics of Gender in the Caribbean Costa Rica, 1870 to 1960. That came out in 2002 under University of North Carolina. And an article to study the fragments, the whole, the microhistory in the Atlantic world in the Journal of Social History in 2006, and a forthcoming article, The Ties Allowed to Bind, Kinship, Legalities, and Migration Restriction in Interwar Americas, which we'll see in International Labor and Working Class History in spring 2013. Her latest book, Radical Moves, Caribbean Migrants and the Politics of Race in the Jazz Age, due out at UNC, or out already, perhaps, this year. Congratulations. Travels from tin roof tropical dance halls to the black-owned ballrooms of Jazz Age Harlem to trace the working class roots of the anti-colonial and anti-racist movements that remade the 20th century. And I think I'm going to probably get on Amazon at the break here. So, so we'd like to hear her talk about her paper, The Rising Tide of Color, Print Circuits and Interactive Peripheries in the Interwar Era.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers, and thank you all for being here bright and early on a Saturday morning when you could have been still in bed or enjoying a third cup of coffee. So in this paper, I'm trying to think about the peripheral press and thinking about what it explains, perhaps. So trying less to explain the press and more to use the press to explain something else. And in some ways, this is this paper. I sort of took advantage of the invitation to put together this paper to try to work through some ideas that I had about how the degree to which the rise of a new kind of local papers in places in the colonial world, so local papers published by almost always men of color in places like the British Caribbean, places that British Caribbean migrants went to in Southern Africa, in West Africa as well. And thinking about whether the rise of this local papers in all of these sites can help us understand how it is that a really important shift happened in politics and social movements in the interwar era. And this is the surge of a whole range of anti-colonial internationalisms, which the Marcus Garvey's UNIA is one of the most well-known ones of these. Of course, Gandhi's movement and organizing against the Raj in India can be seen as yet another one of these. And within Southern Africa, there are also movements in this direction in West Africa as well. This is the same period of the emergence of the new Negro in the United States. And so there's sort of the title that I grabbed for my revised title for my paper, The Rising Tide of Color, actually comes from this incredibly racist screed by the white supremacist Lothrop Stoddard, the man who coined the term or popularized the term white supremacy, which he felt was endangered by this rising tide of color. But I like the term, this notion of a rising tide captures something of the sort of global and broad spread of interconnection of a sort of social movements happening in disparate ways in different places, but with certain characteristics in common. And part of what I'm trying to do in this paper is think about whether paying attention to the press and the rise of the press allows us to make sense of the internationalism of this moment and the connections between it without putting too much emphasis on a small handful of intellectuals who we know, or leaders who we know were traveling the world in this period. And so there's sort of as a side note, in part I've been noticing there's been a lot of fantastic publication about Black Caribbean intellectuals and sort of radical networks in the interwar years recently, which has sort of brought back to our attention a whole series of really important figures. George Padmore and a lot of Black Marxists and the Garveys, of course. So you have all these really interesting intellectuals, and yet I'm wondering whether we're overvaluing the impact of these sort of globe-trotting or world traveling activists and intellectuals who went from being names known to a small number of people in their day to being completely forgotten for a long time, and suddenly now being the target of a lot of publishing because there are new technologies that make it possible to do research on these people in new ways. That's fantastic. And yet, on the other hand, are we maybe overvaluing political networks at the, if not top down, sort of bottom of the top downward, say, and not paying enough attention to the kind of social dynamics that might be driving these social movements? So what I do in this paper is try to give you something of a panorama of what I mean when I say there were lots of new papers being published by editors of color within the colonial world in this era. So I start in a place I know nothing about, which is Africa, and really just relying on secondary literature, point out how many new papers were being published in this era, and also the degree, sort of what's going on in these papers. And even some, for instance, in both West Africa and Southern Africa, there are some papers that had actually been founded in the 1880s by colonials of color, but which become really what I would call black internationalist in this era, become very much intentionally connected to struggles of people of color in North America, in the Caribbean. So if you're reading the newspaper in West Africa, you're hearing about the anti-lynching movement in the United States. You're hearing about struggles in South Africa. You're hearing about new protest movements against colonial rule in India. So that these local papers are carrying international news. And not just any old international news, they're carrying international news, they're sort of filtering, they're selecting international news with an increasingly specific optic, and that is struggles against the injustices of white rule. And the reason, of course, that they can do this is because of the circulation of other press, other prints as well. And so exchange lists are something that I look at in the case of the papers that I've worked with most closely, which are the ones within the British Caribbean, actually not British Africa. So then in the paper I move from Africa, where I'm trying to give something of a panorama of the trends in publishing, and then look more closely at some of the cases from the British Caribbean. One thing I do note for both cases really is how labor migration, new kinds of political organizing, and the creation of reading publics go hand in hand. And that's the case in Southern Africa and Western Africa and in the Circum-Caribbean as well. So you have, in this period for the Greater Caribbean, you have literally hundreds of thousands of British Caribbeans leaving their islands of origin, seeking work in Panama or the banana plantations of Central America, the sugar plantations of Cuba, or increasingly Harlem. And these migrants, as almost all migrants are self-selected. So they're coming from relatively literate societies, as parts of the colonial world go. They're coming from societies with literacy ranging between 30 to 60 or 70%, depending on which island. But the working class Black British Caribbean communities in Panama have 95% literacy in this period. So and they're working class communities. These are people who are, shovel and pickmen, but very highly literate. And so these, migration creates the need for information, and having more information creates new opportunities for migration. So there's you can really see the way that the circulation of papers, the circulation of information within it is both driven by the expanding knowledge needs of people becoming very heavily dependent on labor migration as a form of advancement, but also, so the press is also making possible a sort of expanding worldview, which spreads the awareness of a geography into which one might well move. And so people within British Caribbeans living in Panama are routinely reading the Negro World, which is published in New York, but they're also subscribing to the Pittsburgh Courier, published in Pittsburgh. And they're not just reading the occasional copy, they're subscribing and they're writing in letters to the Courier. And they're waiting for answers. So they're writing in letters, to the editor of the Lovelorn column, saying, please, you have to answer because I don't know whether my woman loves me or not. So you have this sort of ongoing dialogue created. You really, I think, see the creation of a public of color because it's very much it's both racially defined. So the idea of forming part of a supranational and supra-imperial Negro race is very important. But one thing I also attend to in this more or less the closing of the paper, or the last section of the paper, is the tension or just simply the alternation between, on the one hand, a sort of specifically racially defined notion of the greater collective, speaking in terms of the Negro race very specifically, and references to a broader world of color or of colonial people struggling against white domination, which rather than drawing the border lines around being Negro, being Black, rather sees commonalities between the struggles of China, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So it sort of struggles against racist policies anywhere you encounter them. And I suggest that while some publishers in this era, probably Marcus Garvey most prominently among them, do sort of hew to a sort of romantic territorialist racialism, sort of typical of that interwar era. But many of the other publishers of color who I'm looking at are very intentional. They're anti-essentialist, anti-racists. So on the one hand, they're arguing against racism, but they're doing so in ways that doesn't sort of essentialize what it is that we, the Negro people, must do, but rather sort of looks outward and sketches, as I say, a sort of broader potential coalition, or as it's sort of being described as sort of coalition in the making of people of color. And so you see in, for instance, the newspaper of a newspaper called The West Indian, published by T.A. Marishow in Grenada, which I should say is the newspaper that Malcolm X grew up learning how to read by reading Marishow's West Indian, because his mother was a Grenadian immigrant to the United States, and there are testimonies from his brother about how their mother sat them down every day and taught Malcolm X to read by reading the West Indian in the 1940s. So Marishow's West Indian describes, for instance, borrowing sometimes from Du Bois's Crisis, describes in a sort of just a typical day, the bell has struck, the front page tells us. India has declared for independence. China is determined to try all residents in China in her own courts. Egypt has elected a parliament of nationalists, and Ethiopia has sent a minister to England. The myth of the divine overlordship of Europe over the colored world is beginning to fade. And so you see this sort of broad panorama that this press is summoning its readers to feel themselves a part of. And this also means that as struggles are emerging in one part of the world, in particular for readers within the British Empire, people are gauging very carefully what is Britain doing. So how is colonial policy reacting to protests in West Africa, to the question of the disenfranchisement of the Cape Town coloreds? What is Great Britain doing? Because people are trying to judge very specifically, like how much political pressure can we bring to bear within empire to make demands for greater political engagement here at home in Barbados or in Jamaica or in X or Y or Z place? Well, actually knowing what's happening in Cape Town isn't just of theoretical interest. It's not just a matter of inspiration. It's actually very useful information for us in terms of what kinds of pressure do or don't have which kinds of results. A final paper that I look at is one called the Panama American, published by a Jamaican editor named Sidney Young in Panama. He's one, just a parenthetical note, he's one of a great number of these editors of color who'd fought in the British West India Regiment in the Great War. So they fought as part of the British West India Regiment that was promised a role in combat in the Great War, and then the British Army pulled back and said we couldn't possibly have armed black men fighting against white Europeans. That would be all wrong. And so these men were sent to serve as labor troops instead in North Africa, and they were deeply embittered about their experiences there. But they also had gained enormous amounts of sort of global knowledge and also sort of civic camaraderie and engagement. So there's this sort of post-war boom in the press in the hands of these men. In some ways, I was reminded of this yesterday when people were talking about the libraries being founded by returning soldiers after the war, or reading circles. So there's civic activism of this generation of men, which also feeds into the existence of this new kind of local press that's very much interconnected both with other local papers of its kind and also with metropolitan papers as well. Thank you.
Wow. Me toca, my turn. So perspective is everything, and since I wasn't completely introduced, my perspective is that of a world historian, and world historians are a curious lot. Perhaps you know a few. Some people think we know a lot about a lot of things. That would be true of Dr. Murillo, who was here yesterday, actually. Most of us know a little bit about lots of different things, so connections and stuff. So a lot of this is familiar to me in that way. So my perspective is probably going to be revealed pretty quickly from that worldview or lens or silo even, perhaps, I don't know. So first, fascinating paper about Indian print culture and knowledge networks by Professor Hall. So I'll start with what I see as the global context of each paper as I talk about them. And in this case, England is developing its approach to controlling the subcontinent of India in an historical period that's been characterized by some intense moral debate. For example, in 1808, they eliminate the slave trade for moral reasons, and although it could be argued and should be argued probably as much for economic reasons. But there's that discourse going on. That's the background. That's, I think, behind a lot of what's happening in this paper. They want control of the subcontinent, but they'd much rather have it by employing the native elite to do the management of it for them, along the worldview that they perceive as being the proper progressive way of life. And this work is done through the company. The British had a different approach to imperialism than some other powers, in that they like to have the East Indian Company take an active role in it, as you saw also in the paper. And backed by the strong moral purpose that they sense, the production of knowledge that explains and supports the imperial order is therefore encouraged, and translation of this knowledge is encouraged. And I think that's what's really exciting about this paper, is the translation. So I must say that I'm reminded of how much of an image learner I really am, because I think the paper is a lot clearer to me this morning than my first 3 readings, because it says more about me than you. Yeah, and especially the Venn diagrams and then the circles before helped me quite a bit. I'm reminded about a work in U.S. Native American history called The Middle Ground, which takes me back to graduate school days. And the principle behind this was by Richard White is that it's temporal, but it's also spatial and it's cultural. If you think about 3 different sort of chunks of periods, there's a period where the hegemony culturally and politically belongs to the indigene. And then there's a period, and at the end of that, there's a period, in this case, post-1857, in which the hegemony belongs more clearly to the conqueror. And in the middle is the middle ground. And that middle ground, that period in the middle ground, is this contested period when there's lots of confusing things going on. Or Anglophone, then, and somebody from my field, Latin America, says that colonial situations breed confusion. And so there's these communications and miscommunications that are going on, and agendas that are sometimes difficult to completely figure out. But that's where the exciting stuff happens, always, to me, the interaction. And that's what's going on in this chunk in that paper for me. Right? Professor Hall argues that print culture changes through time in the subcontinent, and that's influenced by I like the tripartite circle there, the missionary impact, the civil society, and then the production of dictionaries and what I would call ethnographies or ethnologies or cultural histories and private and primary sources of ethnography that then again come back round circle. That made a big leap for me to influence the missionaries again. So I was looking for a chronology in the paper, and I think the reason why I wasn't seeing one is that it's really a kind of a spiral in a way, which I thought was really cool in listening to it this morning. As we push into mid-century, some of these new Orientalist approaches are starting to win out and have a big impact. I think actually the most intellectually interesting part of the paper to me, besides the incredible evidential base here, which I suppose is only the tip of an iceberg, is this sort of rethinking of Orientalism. And actually, that's one thing that the 2 papers share. At one point, they've taken an idea in a book really, and sort of turned it upside down and switched it around a little bit in a way that makes more sense to us the way we're thinking now. I think about things. So that I think probably would be ripe for some more discussion at some point. A number of these other things I was going to say I think probably would be a little redundant from what he was actually describing in the paper, so I'll just move through here a little bit more. The divisions that happen that are based around the language, tension between the languages that were spelled out pretty well, I think, here, between Madras and other areas, Calcutta. It's interesting. There's a fairly big change that's underway in which I see that the religiously connected knowledge, so in terms of production of knowledge production, that's in a cultural studies kind of sense, that's shifting from a sort of religious context that's related by the deep history of Indian philosophy, really, towards construction of knowledge in a way that makes sense in a secular and academic setting. So people are trying to find out how things are fitting or not, right? becomes controversial in England, and eventually, I like the fact that the paper actually triumphs with the 1857 event, because I think that is a real turning point in there. They've had enough. The experiment is over in some sense, right? And there's some really delicious quotes in the very end of the paper that I think bear repeating, that sort of show this tension towards that's building up in the mid-19th century. John Leyden, who says, or Leyden perhaps it is, the moral character of the Hindus, the blameless, mild, patient, innocent children of nature, as they are ridiculously termed by gossiping ignoramuses. That might be the missionaries, I don't know. Some missionaries often tend to do that. Who never set eyes on them, is as utterly worthless and devoid of probity as their religion is wicked, shameless, impudent, and obscene. So it's ending for him. And then this contrast with the Orientalist William Erskine's characterization of an ideal Orientalist, right? Says that the Orientalist scholar F.W. Ellis was remarkable for the proficiency he had made in various languages in southern India, and for his thorough acquaintance with the manners, customs, and literature of the Hindus. He is said to have written the Tamil and with great elegance, and was a poet in that tongue. He was eager to improve the conditions of the natives, but had perhaps too high an opinion of their literature and requirements. He lived much among the natives and had a perfect knowledge of their habits and thinking. So one of this sort of goals, really, in so many frontiers in world history, when you have the imperialist or the colonist wanting colonial power, wanting to engage the other, is to find out as much as you can about them. You know, the Jesuits, we know about Jesuits now, because surprisingly one is now a pope. I never thought I'd see the day. But they were remarkable in this way in the American frontiers that I study. You know, I mean, they would live in the most godforsaken places and try to learn all kinds of cool languages, and really just driven by the desire to be able to, bit by bit, try to get people to understand their one true faith. Sometimes successful and often not. With the early years of the empire, saw evidence to blend indigenous and English traditions. This just shifted over time. One interesting example was the deist roots of the company employees. So the company employees are going to be different than these Baptist missionaries and others, right? They kept them from being too concerned. They weren't so concerned about the continuation of Hindu caste practices, as long as people keep doing their work, I guess. The mission-driven press and others weren't so certain about this potential for the Indians, as we can see in that quotation. And the question for mid-century Orientalists, as the author notes, is whether social reform and education could graft onto Indian learning traditions to bring about needed reforms. I think this is the central question, and the answer by 1857, when there's rumors of pig fat being used on the bullets of hired soldiers, the Muslim and the Hindu soldiers rebel. We have the Sepoy Rebellion, and the history of India changes pretty radically at that point. So I see the paper as a really fascinating sort of deep dive into a middle ground period that's elucidated so much more clearly because of the use of these written texts. Absolutely fascinating, and I feel shame that I only know 2 languages. So I guess there's one more than many U.S. people do know. Well, let me turn then to the second paper. As you can see, I'm not offering a lot, and I hope that others can offer more. So, but I perhaps have a little more common with the second one, because besides being a world historian, all world historians are actually, well, most, not all, most are trained within one particular regional specialty. Mine was Latin America back in the day. And I've since actually, the last couple of years, learned how to teach African history. So what I do a lot is teach, but in a small place. So we decided to train me how to do that. And so that has produced some incredible connections, which resonate very clearly in your paper for me. And some of them are ideal, and some of them are actual. And that's actually the thing that's floating around for me around a lot of this kinds of the subject, which is, I think, an intractable problem of trying to do bottom-up history. So I'll probably get back to that in a minute. So in The Rising Tide of Color is excellent choice of a title, purloined from an otherwise disappointing guy. The people of color were exercising their political agency in various places in the world between the wars. Because, in a lot of ways, from a world historical perspective, the moral poverty of imperialism is laid clear after the First World War, and is actually, a fork is totally put into it after the Second World War. So most people recognize the incredible irony of fighting for freedom when you're holding people in bondage. This is definitely a theme in African history among people there. So that it's not a question of if, but when the European colonies there are going to be decolonized. Nationalism will rise. National independence will rise, which has happened in a lifetime of you and me. Probably, I'm not saying about anybody else in the room, but most of it's happened, since the 50s. So. And so this is a kind of a middle period when that's really starting to getting going. And some of these stories, you're right, are quite well known in terms of attempts for internationalism. With Garvey is quite well known, and others, and these meetings that happen in various places in London and somewhere in Southeast Asia. I'm forgetting myself right now. In various places, and so these are hopeful signs that people of color are united. But of course, these are not your ordinary. These are elite people that are well educated and have benefited from the master's education or Western education, and it's not the mass of people. And so what's exciting about this paper is that although it's not the ordinary laborer we're talking about here, there are, well, in some cases maybe more so, but there's a lot more than 99% involved, right, in today's language, in this discourse about imperialism and how things ought to be changing, as seen through the press, right? So the central question that I get from the paper is how do the peripheral press and publications in general and other written documents and influence other people, ordinary people, to think about resistance and consider it, to discuss it, and how does this become a linkage kind of across the whole world, really, right? I'm sure you guys have this experience when you teach. Our students presume linkages, right? Because you get on this machine here and they're all over the place, right? They've never lived in a world in which linkages weren't an idea, right? But in the interwar period, these kinds of linkages are hard wrought, and especially for people who are not at in the sort of pinnacle positions of their social groups. So a lot of research has been done on these traveling radicals and the black nationalists, and I'm glad that you're playing off of that. And that they're the drivers of this process. So there are sort of two models or ideas that were running through my head as I read this and as I listened to you again this morning. And one is it comes again from graduate school, from Eric Wolf and the Peoples Without History, and the notion that you're to be able to start to talk about how people lived, what they read, what they did, what they believed, is really difficult if they don't leave a long paper trail. This is like the intractable problem of doing the history of ordinary people, the history of women, the history of workers, because through much of history, and so they become, in his words, people without history. So we're swimming upstream to try to be able to do that, right? We need to be patient with ourselves and not have the same yardstick. So this is a piece of intellectual history in the same sense that or probably all these are, I guess, that we're trying to cover sources and expressions intellectually, but in a popular or more popular context, which is quite exciting. I think I was really interested in the sort of dual expression by Lloyd George and by Garvey. Lloyd George said the Negro race is beginning to stir into conscious life. At the same time that Garvey is exhorting his crowds of the awakening of the mighty race, which is, there's a certain irony there, but maybe there isn't, right? The audiences and the messages are both different and similar. The other model that I think about comes from world history. Actually, comes from Pat Manning, believe it or not. And that is that, in some sense, world history, if you want to define it as a subject, is not just all of history together put in this room, which is, I think, what most people come to think. But it's actually, we focus on the connections. You know this from your Indian Ocean world. It's a very huge subject for world historians. And then on patterns. So those dual sorts of things, right? You see these things written this way over and over again. There's a book called Traditions and Encounters by the late Jerry Bentley, for example. It's the same idea: patterns of traditions and encounters of connections. So it's kind of both, right? And so I was looking through the paper and counting up some of the things that I thought were connections and some of the things that I thought were patterns. Of course, the connections are the things that are most exciting, especially in this account where we're seeing connections between people who normally we don't, right, which is the great value of the work, of course. And so there are connections between the UNIA or Garvey's Negro World publication that went around the world to thousands of people in the 1920s, and there were English and Spanish and French reports from Cape Town to Santiago de Cuba. And so how many people actually reached and talked about it? It's more than just the readers, right? Is who can say? But it's fascinating to me that people of color, black people, really in two different sides of the pond there, are finding out about each other because of this, right? And that's a little different than Garvey's political work in itself. But the impact of it is something that's much greater than his initial agenda to get people moved back to the homeland, for example. And then in Ghana and Accra, there several papers brought information about home rule in India, in Freetown or Lagos or the KKK in the United States, right? So you have this international history of color, international stories of people of color that in their relationship to the metropolis that ordinary people are being connected with, right? The connections of the founder, one of the founders of the South African Native National Congress, and that connected with people in England, and he had his own connections as well, spending decades in Kimberley, in other regions as well. In the British West Indies, very interesting to note. I'm glad that you did that. The literacy rate is quite a bit higher there, and so the impact of this more ordinary readership is going to be greater, right? Readers of the Barbados Weekly Herald discussed the racism in their island and elsewhere. So. Then there were patterns. There were fewer patterns, I thought, but there's some parallels with Pan-African conferences that occurred, and there were some conferences that are happening in London meetings. That parallels with at the same time of these discussions of ordinary people. So parallel or a pattern would be, for example, if you think about the development of a long time ago in the pre-1500 period, the development of agriculture happens in like we think a half dozen, 7 different places, right? And then it spreads, right? So both those things happen. So impressively, it happens, or miraculously perhaps, it happens in different places, right? So those are patterns. So there's some patterns of conversations that don't seem to be connected that are brought up. But we can connect them ourselves. We need to know what it is we're connecting them when they were connected for people in the time. But it's interesting to see those patterns, right? And there can be patterns of difference as well. One of the different patterns was whether or not people were working within the colonial order or working against it, right? you adeptly point out, in many cases, people are actually not offering an anti-colonial discourse, but trying to bring the colony to bear with its own values, and as opposed to asking to overrule it completely. Yeah, I know. There's just I don't know, just a lot. I'm really looking forward to reading more about both and hearing more about both of these things. I think that the great I really like the distinction that you made about Du Bois and his ability or his inability to be able to see people of color as a broader category, and how people are tugging at that at this point, and showing that there is a connection. It's like when people of color were making connections about the war in Vietnam and how it was racist that resonated with them with racism at home, right? So this is happening to a certain extent beyond Garvey, right? By people who are further, in a more ordinary position, it seems to me. So in sum, I think there's a lot of value for this, and the great challenge is to be able to prove what difference it makes, right? It's really hard to prove what difference it makes, and that's why People Without History has not been written, right? Because we can't wrap our minds completely scientifically around it in the way we can others. If you think about, for example, what was the impact that common sense, Thomas Paine's common sense, had on the founding fathers of the United States and mothers, you can look at their writings and see if they mention Thomas Paine. Simple, right? And it's mentioned a lot. Turns out he was pretty important for a lot of people, right? Not probably for Alexander Hamilton, but probably for some people. And so we can say, hey, impact, was on there. It's difficult because they don't have this broad of a database or evidentiary base to be able to make such a statement about iterations that have been made by ordinary people. So, and that does not mean that we should not do it. And that it actually means that we need to do it even all the more and let ourselves out of the box a little bit as scholars to recognize what it is we do know and we don't know. But we can presume a lot that some of these publications did have an impact on the histories that were involved. So that is what I have to say. Oh, yes. Is that what you do next for this?
Yeah.
Okay, your turn then. No, yeah.
I'll just briefly talk about the Sepoy Mutiny here, as long as we do this.
Yeah.
So the paper does address basically the distinction of the British East India Company Army in particular, that as opposed to embracing local languages, they totally embraced then the Persian and the Urdu traditions that are holdover from the Mughal administration and set themselves apart then from the other sort of initiatives that are here in maintaining that military.
Company does.
Actually, it's the troops themselves. The troops, because the company is there, but then the military component of that is a separate entity from the secular administration. And basically, working within this, it's the troops themselves who make this decision too.
That's cool.
That the troops themselves reject then developing their own native language traditions in this case. And again, we'll do this in the militant tradition that is there, which then leads in then to the Sepoy Mutiny, where again you have this very strong Islamic tradition that is a part of that heritage that's developed under the British administration, company administration, that sets off the spark that derives then from that. So.
No, I really appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the wide perspective that you're bringing to it, and I'd like to throw the floor open.
Sure. Should I call on people? Is that how I do it? Okay. I have the power. I'm British.
When you looked at the rise of the black press, I'm really interested in the primary points of disagreement and divergence. And I'm just thinking, in the United States, we have sort of the Garvey group, we have the A. Philip Randolph group, we have the Du Bois groups, and there was a great deal of acrimony between these different perspectives. How does that emerge in the international black press that you're looking at, or doesn't it?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that even within the United States, if you think about readers rather than editors,
Right.
some of that acrimony sort of dissipates, right? I mean, it's because you have so many people who started out editing. I mean, everyone sooner or later edited the Negro World for 6 months before they had some big blow up with Garvey and swore off and never again. So whether it's Domingo, whether it's Hubert Harrison, so you get people like ideologically pretty much all over the map. Some of them end up being Marxists, end up being socialists, but they at one point they were at the head of the Negro World, right? So I think if you take the if you think about the papers, I mean, obviously those feuds are really important for understanding certain things, but maybe not so important for understanding readers' experience of the papers, because I mean I spend a lot of time reading papers from the 1920s, so I basically know a tiny little slice of the universe. But sitting in that chair, right, reading something like the kinds of papers, like long runs of the kinds of papers that the people who I'm studying were reading, you don't even quite perceive those big rifts. You perceive some papers are very explicitly anti-communist, and other papers that actually were headed by Marxists are not anti-communist, although even those are rarely explicitly pro-Marxist. So I don't know how many of and you do see disputes over what strategy should we follow moving forward, but those disputes were also, they were daily disputes over, Garveyism and whether the UNA had the right track or not, whether Garvey had been duped and misled when he bought the wrong ships for the Black Star Line. Right. People are arguing about that all the time, but not we have formed different factions, but rather just here we are in a mechanics hall in Panama, and the things that really matter to us are, are our wages going to go down on the canal, and do we have access to housing, and did Garvey follow the right strategy with the ships? These are people felt these issues to be sort of very much part of their daily lives, but not in ways. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it was all sort of more mixed up together. And I think certainly judging by letters to the editor, which is one of the things I do try to read to get at that sort of broader participation, people felt entitled to have opinions on all of this, and in ways that didn't line up neatly with the sort of categories that we've used to think about the leaders of these movements.
What you're just saying right now, Laura, I think actually goes to the kind of methodology you're trying to use, which is to go from the bottom up instead of from the top down. Because if you do in fact focus on leaders, right? I mean, leaders are forceful personalities who define themselves very clearly, and their differences stand out. And so, but I mean, I guess the thing is that when you don't look, I mean, I guess this is what I want to say, is that if you look at, if you read the movement through the leaders, you get differences. And there is a way, in fact, that I think that looking at it that way has this kind of tail of hegemonic thinking with it, where it becomes a way of saying this movement didn't work, or it worked too slowly because they couldn't agree. Right, whereas the stuff that you're looking at is actually not about, it's really not so much about agreement on these big sort of stark lines between different kinds of leaders. It's really sort of more locally based and all that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what you're getting at is that if you're focusing on the leaders and thinking in terms of the success or failure of the movements, there's no way to get around that enormous condescension of history, right? You're always going to be thinking about why they failed to do what you know that they should have done. But if you're just reading the daily papers, right, you don't know that that's how it all ends. And if anything, it was yesterday, Scott, who I think is not here, was talking about the Southern evangelicals and their faith that if they just founded one more paper, that would do the trick. So if you read the pages of these newspapers from Panama and Costa Rica and Barbados and Grenada, the faith that just creating another newspaper was going to really open up this incredible world of fighting for freedom together and greater rights and justice. People were not cockeyed optimists, but people had a real faith that they could turn themselves into a public. They would almost have used that term. The term public is certainly used with a real ideological freighting in this era.
Well, that's another thing that I was thinking is that actually what you're talking about really is a classic counter-public sphere.
Yeah.
And public spheres aren't places where everybody agrees. They're places where local differences are worked out with the interest of then visiting that speaking truth to power,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So I think that's really what you have there. You call it the development of an anti-colonial international public, and I think that's really what's happening there.
I have a question for Lara and a question for Ken. These might wind up connected somehow. Lara, I was really struck by the provenance of your title and thinking of how you're reappropriating. I'm wondering, does that kind of reappropriation happen in the newspapers, where it's, this might also in some ways bounce off Pat's question, that it's not that all the stuff is from a single perspective, but when it gets placed in the newspaper, things get co-opted into the newspaper's perspective. I'm wondering to what extent that's happening. And Ken, I was really curious about that print of the Orientalist, and I was wondering, where did that show up? You know, who was publishing that? Where was it circulating? So, you know, who was interested in producing but also seeing a print portrait of that group?
Go ahead and answer that first.
The answer is, it came out of the time period after the founding of the society. This is the beginning of the society itself. And this connects then to the statue that we have in St. Paul's, of that very positivist environment for that type of again, presentation that you have at that period of time. So again, if you want to connect that then to the St. Paul statue of Jones, they all sort of fit together in that period, as well as the Clarendon Library that I showed you too, with the inscription that hails this idea of the partnership between India then and England that is there.
That's cool.
Jane.
So the way I came across Lothrop Stoddard was because he was being mentioned in the papers that I'm reading, as that he had a debate with W.E.B. Du Bois in Chicago in the early 1920s. It was kind of famous, in which he got owned by Du Bois. And one of the things, and your broader point of whether there's a range of different ideas out there that are getting sort of co-opted in these pages is exactly on target. And actually, one thing I had meant to write about in this paper and then just found I didn't have time to was like the practices of glossing that you see in the paper, and in particular the ways that editors are taking things from any range of sort of learned and popular print production from the US and Europe as well, especially lots of things written by like condescending white liberals, and using that information, but also adding in like a few sentences of glosses that really skewer those pretensions. So in one case, their quote at great length an article about Gandhi and how Gandhi, has proven that his people deserve liberty. And then there's a commentary at the end, we agree with much of the information that's being given here, but obviously it's incredibly ignorant to talk about people deserving liberty. By the very fact that they're human, they deserve liberty. They don't have anything to prove to anyone. So this kind of move in which they're able to take a sort of wide range of production and use it as inputs for building this global vision, and also sort of assert this ability to like watch the watchers. They're sort of looking at, white press commenting, by, whether it's Lothrop Stoddard or the white liberals commenting on black people and what they're doing. And they're, applying a very explicitly critical vision to the observations that are being made of black people or of people of color from without.
So print holds all these people up to scrutiny.
Yeah, it gives you the opportunity. There's like a leveling piece, intellectually leveling piece of this, because you can just be this guy in Panama, but you can make that point. And you can share that with all your readers.
Ken, I wondered what I could ask you about, you talk about Ibn Said, and I just wondered whether you could tease out a little bit more, because it seemed to me that you felt that Orientalism didn't quite fit in terms of what you were saying about India. And the other thing, which I think it's something that I've heard said rather than necessarily written about, and maybe there is writing about it, to do with Sir William Jones and the whole notion of Indo-European languages. And some people have suggested to me in conversation that accidentally this is the seed of scientific racism. I wonder whether you could comment on both those things.
Yeah, let me start with the last part of that first.
Yes.
And it is the seed of scientific racism as you see this, because again, this is an intellectual tradition as I structured that today. This is all embedded in a very solid intellectual tradition as you're doing these language studies then. And based upon then the development of Western scientific analysis and scholarship that is a part of this process. So you can take the same direction you want to, as essentially this does, in essence then.
How does it do that?
Well, the scholarship is a scientific analysis of language that is here. So again, there's the scientific method that is there as you look at this that lays the seeds then for certain sort of potentials then of carrying this out by pseudoscience or however scientific method you want to then to impart differences of people that would derive from this, you see. And you do get this, whereas you get into the period of social Darwinism in particular, where again a lot of this tends then into issues of race that we have and the abilities. Even the early materials out of the Orientalist tradition in India, if you really look at them very carefully, there is a seed of, yes, we're equal, but that comes out of some of these. But what it is addressed here is that they just haven't had the stimuli then to reach a higher level at that point in time, so that there's no negation of the fact that there is a racial distinction that is here. It's just a matter then of a training process that takes effect. And that's what is embedded then in those Asia societies in the beginning. There's that notion then of a partnership and equal capacity that is there. I think this still carries over into my field as I deal in India with my colleagues in Indian studies. That I think that in general there is the attitude of partnership that still permeates my field in terms of relationships and very high levels then of partnership that are still possible within my field, which goes against the grain then of these, again, seeds then of the negativity that we're talking about here. At least that's why I would pose this, relative to the issue of Orientalism that we see here. The Orientalism that is posed in the origin of the societies at the beginning, which because these are the Oriental societies that we have in Calcutta and in Madras. The theme of this then is the idea of partnership from the very beginning of this. But at the very beginning too, before you begin to embrace Sanskrit as an Indian language of equity, the very beginning, before you get to that point, is the notion that there is still the Greco-Latin Western tradition, there's the superior language tradition, and the very beginning of this Orientalist study then is, again, Sanskrit is part of this lesser language tradition that is there, so even in the linguistic level you get this. And this will especially come out of the mission materials that you see, where they're doing the translation work in the beginning, where there's a real strong sense of racism that is, well, whether it's racist or there's certainly the idea that Indians aren't equal, then you get this. And that, as I argue in the paper, then is the problem with the mission program that is there, that there is always that divide that is there, which is then placated when the British East India Company comes initially and creates this environment then of partnership that will be created then. So this is, again, the Orientalism the way it's supposed to be in theory. Now, where this will go then, as I've done at the end of my paper, and as I did today in the presentation, it all sort of goes bad in the 1850s or 40s or stuff in this instance. But it's a question of whether this is sort of only in that period or whether there's a sort of latent aspect of this along the way here too. And this is where you get into the problems then of Orientalist discourse that is here. But just remember that in your field of English studies, most of your Orientalist critique that Said is building upon is basically a 19th century centered sort of critique that is here, that ignores the earlier period that I'm discussing in this instance, where I am much more optimistic about that, or the intentions that are there as you see this. And equally, as most of the people who do English literature are really focused upon Orientalism and its more Middle Eastern and Mediterranean context, that we see, as I've had to deal with this because I deal with courses in comparative Islam, and I've taught at the University of Chicago. And one year I was doing the seminar there, and everyone in here were basically English language Orientalists in this case. They just had their preconceptions that were here and trying to convince them otherwise. It's just something they didn't want to embrace in the whole process here, which is what you have. And again, where the 19th century stuff is the artistic tradition, the literary traditions that develop out of that 19th century tradition then of English language and again art form that comes out of that period. That we'd say. This is that.
Well, just to say, I've also critiqued Said for his position on other things in terms of representations of Jews, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you would, yeah.
Other questions? Yeah. I'm looking for gender balance, but I guess guess I'll.
Go ahead. So this is a question about tides and panoramas, which is something you finished with. And so it's a question about parts and wholes. But to get into it, I think I told you at breakfast, I was really happy to see that this is actually a paper about the movement of movements. And even though it has no black cats, it still is. No, but it seems to me that one way to run this would be to think about network links and connections, and that the way that you get to a panorama or a tide is through this kind of swarming multiplication of links that can only happen through the multiplication of links. So you need that kind of regional press to make it happen. And the question, though, is about where figures like Garvey or Du Bois, the intellectuals that people have been writing about, end up in that history. And at one point in the paper, you use the word vectors to describe them, which I think is a really useful term. But what that made me think about is a question about how far you would actually want to push the idea. Because it seems to me that if you pushed it far enough, then the dichotomy between a people's history and an intellectual history, or the dichotomy between top-down, bottom-up, would itself come into play. Because instead of looking at top-down, bottom-up, you're looking at links. The way that a Du Bois both serves as a vector for new kinds of sentiments of consciousness of themselves as a movement, as being part of something bigger. But also the way that a Du Bois doesn't make any sense unless you have the swarming multitudes linking to him. Du Bois speaking to himself in Paris is nothing, but Du Bois as a vector for other kinds of associations becomes quite significant. And it seemed to me that if you wanted to push along that lines, that then thinking in terms of vectors, links, networks, publics, which you manage to get yourself out of are histories dependent upon geographical spaces, like Paris, and end up instead in spaces that work citationally in the press. And also in a way, even though Du Bois would stay in the story in that case, a story that gets away from people, even away from readers to a certain extent, and into a world of reference, of citation, of things happening in the world of print. So I was wondering, how far does one go? Does one hold on to the kind of romantic, there's something very seductive about telling a people's history. It makes the story easier to tell. But in a way, it can also get in the way of other kinds of understandings of how these associations accrue and how you end up finding a panorama or a tide from a lot of individual links and pieces.
Yeah, so thank you for those, suggestions. I think I don't want to entirely step away from thinking about the experiential reality within which those representations are being received. So, and here I think the language that Rick was giving us in terms of thinking of both patterns and connections, and one way of simply rephrasing the same thing that you just said is to say that in my thinking, it's really the patterns that drive the connections rather than the connections existing in and of themselves and driving the pattern. So what it is that makes, and by patterns, I'm thinking here of things like labor migration, increasing literacy, the growth of urban areas, the growth of ports with sailors traveling between them and able to pass along, printing matter. Now, obviously, some of those patterns are things that are themselves about connections, but what it's also doing is creating a whole set of new kinds of places and sort of new kinds of people within them. In the ports of Southern Africa, on the diamond mines and gold mines in Southern Africa, in the ports of West Africa, in the the sort of places in and around the Caribbean. So that's not just being driven by connections. It's not the fact that you have Garveyite sailors handing over copies of the Negro World is not actually what's making that. There's sort of a fundamental social and economic shift going on there, which is sort of making the vector significant, and so it's making it matter more. It's what drives the circulation of the Negro World. But on the other hand, so I want both pieces of that to matter, and to think about not overvaluing the piece which we can trace if what we're thinking about in terms of links are simply sort of the disembodied movement of either the embodied movement of a handful of intellectuals or the disembodied movement of the prince. I think we're missing out what the sort of important shifts that are existing in a sort of dialectical relationship with that are social and economic shifts. And part of the reason that I said at the beginning I don't want to let go of the experiential level is that it's you said maybe there's a possibility of thinking about this emergent sort of supranational public without thinking about places. But of course, part of what makes these pages so significant, at least in my reading of them, is the way in which they're insistently global and insistently local at the same time. So on the same pages, you're reading about the local schoolhouse where all the young children have given a recitation about the problem of the Negro in the modern world. And on that same page, you're reading about a UNIA meeting in New York. And on that same page, just over one column over, you're reading about violence against Black people in England and in Cardiff and Wales. These like very local experiences. So the same pages are a place of exchange between people who actually know each other.
Yeah.
And other people who you don't know, but who you clearly imagine yourself as existing in the same world as, because you clearly have so much in common. Even when or when you disagree, you have the right language for disagreeing with each other.
While being hugely admiring of this, and I don't want in any way to disagree with it at all, and it's picking up on points that have been said before.
Disagree, it's fine.
But I said it because what I'm going to say doesn't mean that I'm actually disagreeing with it. I just want to add something, and add the extent. I hope it makes sense about this, but the extent to which, in these multiplicity of levels and of experience you're talking about, confusion can also be created. There's an extent to which, if one is thinking about this in terms of the locale and also the economic and social experience, quite apart from the print, I'm putting it in simple ways, and quite apart from the conveyance of the print, the idea of a supranational, a sort of supranational movement or a supranational identification that's created by print in this complex relationship to what else is also going on, can also create illusory perspectives, in the extent to which the print or the newspaper can be, in a sense, imprisoning as well as liberating. The way in which a false ideal or a false expectation can be built up. In other words, I wonder whether, at the end of the day, in creating this wonderful picture, this very, very complicated picture, which I'm completely sold on. I think it's a very, very exciting project, has an inherent danger of not necessarily noticing the confusions, the false ideals, the false expectations, the creation of a simplicity where a complexity actually exists. For those participants from the bottom up.
For sure, there's a danger of in reading of skipping over the things that don't fit the story that you want to tell. So when you say sort of a danger of creating a false illusion, it's not entirely clear to me which of the two things you mean. Whether sort of as an analyst, I am creating this false image, I think both of these things can happen, or because the people who are reading are creating this false ideal.
Yeah, the role of print in creating.
But I think it's important to look out for both of these things, right? And so, like as one thing I have to be constantly reminding myself of is the fact that I tend to skip over things that I think of as less interesting. So, for instance, like I've given you an entire account of what this press is all about and haven't talked about religion, but people were debating religion all the time in these like relatively orthodox Christian terms that I just find less interesting. But the fact that I find them less interesting doesn't mean that they were less important to the people I'm studying. So that's an example of somewhere where I'm doing my own slight cherry picking of the story here, and that's just something that like one tries to do better at, right? Sort of paying attention to the real range of concerns that were brought together by the people who were studying, not simply the ones that look romantic and like they look romantically like resistance, and skipping over the ones that look less romantically like resistance, because they were part of a seamless whole for the people who, and debates about religion were sort of crucial to the formation of a Black international public in ways that don't get nearly the academic press they should. That's an aside point. So, but whether there's a false simplicity being created in the papers themselves, I don't think there's a single answer. That certainly the Negro world is probably the one that comes closest to that, to some kind of orthodoxy being imposed. And even there, though, you're getting a lot of the same rhetoric coming in from letter writers about, Garvey and saving the world. But even there people are running off in their own directions with the ideas. So I think in part it's also none of these papers have a truly coherent party line, and actually the more peripheral ones, all the less so, because they need to be creating a sort of big tent because they need as many readers as possible. So if you're in a port of 15,000 people, you don't want to alienate half the readership by being entirely doctrinaire, and so I don't see that actually happening. The farther you get from, frankly, the metropoles, the less I see that happening in these papers.
Well, there's much more to discuss. I think we'll have to retire to smaller conversations for a short while, though. So, thank you.
Thank you all.